Welcome to First Beliefs, the podcast dedicated to exploring the ancient wisdom, spiritual traditions, and sacred knowledge that human beings have carried across thousands of years of living, searching, and reaching towards something they could feel but not always name. Whether you have come here tonight to learn, to reflect, or to let the slow cadence of deep history carry you toward rest, you have found the right place. Here, we do not rush. We move the way firelight moves, unhurried, warm, casting its glow gradually outward from a single point of stillness. Tonight, we are going to follow one of the most ancient and elemental threads in all of human experience. Tonight, we follow fire. Not fire as hazard or as chemistry, not fire as the subject of a safety manual or a physics textbook. Fire as the ancients understood it, as something that was never merely a tool, even when it was being used as one. Fire as the first miracle available to human hands. Fire as the thing that separated the people who could make it from every other creature on earth. Fire as the flickering, living, breathing presence that our ancestors gathered around in the dark and felt, with a certainty that preceded language, was somehow more than physical, was somehow alive, was somehow, in ways they would spend thousands of years trying to articulate, divine. This episode is called Fire, Purity, and the Divine in Ancient Persia and Rome. And across our time together tonight, we will move through a long and luminous arc of human history. We will begin at the very beginning, before temples, before civilizations, before any sacred text had been written, with the first human fires made 1,000,000 years ago, and the slow transformation of a survival instinct into a spiritual one. From there, we will travel to ancient Persia, where the Zoroastrian tradition elevated fire to something unprecedented in the religious imagination, not merely a symbol of the divine, but the living presence of truth itself, tended in consecrated temples by priests who dared not breathe on the flame, lest the warmth of the human body defile its purity. We will then cross the ancient world to Rome, where for nearly 1,000 years, a small circle of priestesses called the Vestal Virgins kept an eternal flame burning in a round temple at the heart of the city, guarding in that single unwavering light what Romans believed to be the soul and the fate of their civilization. From there, we will draw the two traditions into conversation with one another, exploring what they shared across the miles and centuries that divided them, and what the recurring human impulse to sanctify fire tells us about the deeper spiritual instincts of our species. And finally, as our journey draws toward its close, we will sit with fire in the way our ancestors sat with it, quietly, contemplatively, letting it speak in the way it has always spoken to those willing to be still enough to listen. This is a long and deeply atmospheric journey. Let your breathing slow, let your body settle. And if at some point the warmth of these ancient flames draws you gently into sleep, that is not a failure of attention. That is the oldest thing fire has ever done for human beings. It made the night feel safe enough to rest. But before we strike the first spark, one small request. If this podcast brings you something of value, a new idea, a moment of genuine quiet, a story that stays with you into tomorrow, please take a moment right now to subscribe to First Beliefs. Leave a comment below telling us which ancient tradition or sacred practice you would most like to explore in a future episode. Now, let the room go dark. Let the flame catch. Let us begin. Part 1. The First Fire. To understand why fire became sacred, we must first understand what fire meant before sanctity entered the picture. We must go back to the very beginning of the human relationship with flame, before religion, before civilization, before the written word. The earliest evidence of controlled fire used by human ancestors stretches back nearly 1 million years, possibly further. Archaeological sites in South Africa, in Kenya, in the caves of northern China have yielded traces of ash and charred bone that speak of fires made and tended by hands not entirely unlike our own. These were not ritual fires. They were not sacred fires. They were survival fires. Warmth against the cold, light against the dark, a barrier of heat and brightness that kept predators at a cautious distance. But even in those earliest expressions, fire was already something that set its tenders apart from the rest of the natural world. No other creature on earth could make it. No other creature could sustain it deliberately, feeding it, protecting it from wind and rain, carrying it from place to place like a slow-burning gift. The mastery of fire was not merely a technological achievement, it was, in some quiet and wordless way, the beginning of a different relationship between humans and the world they inhabited. Imagine, for a moment, a night 100,000 years ago. A small group of people, perhaps a family in the broadest sense of that word, has made camp on the edge of a forest. The temperature falls as the sun disappears. The sounds of the night grow louder. And then someone, perhaps a young woman with a steady hand and a knowledge passed down through careful watching, bends to a small pile of prepared tinder and coaxes a flame into being. The group gathers. There is warmth. There is light. Children settle close. Elders extend their hands toward the heat. Food cooks above the flame, releasing its nourishment more fully than raw eating ever could. And in this gathering, something social and emotional happens that is very difficult to put into words. The fire becomes the center. It becomes the place around which the group is defined. This pattern repeated itself across tens of thousands of years in every environment on Earth, in every culture that would eventually give rise to civilization. Fire was the hearth was the home, and the home was the foundation of everything that would follow. But somewhere in the long unfolding of human history, something began to shift. The relationship with fire deepened. It grew more complex, more charged with meaning. And this is not difficult to understand if we sit with it quietly. Fire gives light, but it also destroys. It gives warmth, but it also burns. It purifies metal, but it also consumes forests. Fire is, in the most direct sense, a force of transformation. It takes one thing and makes it into something else entirely. Wood becomes ash. Raw meat becomes cooked food. Clay becomes pottery. Ore becomes metal. And in every one of these transformations, something essential passes through fire and comes out changed. It would have been very natural for people of the ancient world to begin to see fire not merely as a tool, but as an agent of change. as something that possessed in its heat and brightness a power that ordinary matter did not. And from that observation, it was not a very great distance to the first sacred fires. Part 2. Fire and the Divine. The Persian Tradition. Of all the ancient civilizations that elevated fire to a position of spiritual significance, perhaps none did so with more philosophical depth and ceremonial care than the people of ancient Persia. The religion we are speaking of is Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest continuously practiced religions in the world. Its origins reach back to a time before recorded history made its earliest marks on the Iranian plateau. Scholars have debated the precise dates with great care, but it is generally understood that the faith, as shaped by the teachings of its prophet Zarathustra, known in the Greek tradition as Zoroaster, emerged somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 years ago, possibly earlier. Zarathustra was, by the account of the texts attributed to him, a visionary, a man who received revelation and who articulated in poetry that has been described as extraordinary in its beauty, a vision of the universe as the battleground between two fundamental principles, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the force of truth, light, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, the force of falsehood, darkness, and chaos. In this framework, fire held a position of remarkable significance. It was not worshipped as a deity in itself, and it is important to say this clearly because it is a misunderstanding that has followed Zoroastrianism through much of its recorded history. Fire was not a god to be appeased or petitioned. It was something more subtle than that. Fire was a symbol of divine truth. It was the visible presence of Ahura Mazda's light in the physical world. It was the closest thing available to human senses through which the divine could be perceived. The word used in the Zoroastrian tradition for this sacred quality of fire is Asha. Asha means truth, righteousness, order. It is the principle upon which the good universe is founded. And fire, because it gives light, because it drives back darkness, because it burns away impurity, was considered the most perfect embodiment of Asha that the physical world contained. To tend a sacred fire in this understanding was not merely a ritual act, it was an act of cosmic participation. The priest who fed the flame was, in a very real theological sense, contributing to the ongoing battle between truth and falsehood. Every piece of wood placed carefully on the fire was an act of alignment with the divine order of the universe. Every breath directed to encourage the flame was a breath given to truth. This is a beautiful idea, and it is one that, once understood, makes the extraordinary care that Zoroastrian tradition invested in its fire temples entirely comprehensible. Part 3. The Fire Temples of Ancient Persia. The fire temples of the Zoroastrian tradition are among the most serene and thoughtfully constructed sacred spaces in the ancient world. Known in the Persian language as Atashkadeh, meaning house of fire, these were not simply places of gathering for prayer. They were, in the most literal sense, dwelling places for the sacred flame itself. At the heart of every fire temple was a fire burning in a large metal vessel, often of bronze or iron, raised on a platform or altar. This fire was tended continuously, day and night, by priests whose role in society was defined almost entirely by this act of careful stewardship. The fire was never allowed to go out. Its extinction would have been understood not merely as a practical failure, but as a spiritual catastrophe, a dimming of divine truth in the world. The priests who tended these fires were trained from childhood in the precise and careful methods of their work. They knew how to add fuel without disturbing the flame, how to clean the altar without allowing the fire to be contaminated by ash or impure matter. When working near the sacred fire, they wore a cloth covering over their mouth and nose, not as a symbol of fear, but as a practical expression of purity. The breath of a human being, however devout, was considered potentially contaminating to the fire's sacred quality. The flame was to be kept as clean as the truth it represented. Different categories of sacred fire existed within the tradition, and these were understood to carry different degrees of sanctity. The most sacred of all was the Atash Bahram, the fire of victory, a flame of the very highest grade. The construction of an Atash Bahram was an extraordinarily involved undertaking. Fires from 16 different sources, each representing a different class of people and a different form of human productive activity, were gathered together and purified through an elaborate ritual process lasting months. Fires from a king, a soldier, a priest, a craftsman, a shepherd, and many others were collected and ceremonially merged, creating a flame that symbolically encompassed the whole of human society and its relationship with the divine. Once established, an Atash Bahram was treated with the reverence due to a living sacred presence. It was housed in a building specifically designed to honor it. Worshippers who came to the temple would approach, but not too closely. They would pray before the fire, offer wood as a gift, recite the ancient hymns called gathas that Zarathustra had composed in his moments of revelation. And then they would withdraw, leaving the flame to its quiet and eternal work. There is something deeply moving about this image when we allow ourselves to sit with it, a flame in a bronze vessel in a stone room, tended in silence, burning through centuries. The world outside changes, empires rise and fall, languages transform, cities are built and abandoned, and still the fire burns, steadily, quietly. An unbroken line of light stretching back through time. Some Zoroastrian sacred fires have reputedly been burning for extraordinary lengths of time. The Iransha, the flame housed at the Udvada temple in Gujarat, India, is said by the Parsi Zoroastrian community to be the same flame that was carried from Persia centuries ago during a great migration. Whether or not the literal continuity of every single flame can be confirmed by historical documentation, the spiritual truth that the tradition is asserting is clear. This is not merely a fire. This is a living connection to something ancient and holy, an inheritance of light, passed carefully from hand to hand across generations. Part 4. The meaning of purity. The Zoroastrian understanding of fire as a purifier opens a window into one of the most enduring themes in the history of sacred fire. The idea that flame does not merely destroy but cleanses. In the ancient world, Purity was not primarily a concept of cleanliness in the modern hygienic sense. It was a metaphysical category. Something pure was something that was aligned with the divine order, free from the contamination of chaos, darkness, or falsehood. And fire, in its capacity to consume and transform, was seen as a natural agent of purification. Think of what fire does when viewed through this lens. It takes organic matter, wood, grass, grain, and burns away everything that is not essential. What remains is ash, yes, but the heat and light produced are understood as the release of something purer than the material form that contained it. In metallurgy, fire burns away the impurities in ore, leaving behind refined metal. In cooking, fire transforms food into a form that is both more nourishing and more digestible. In every case, fire mediates a passage from one state to another, and what emerges is understood as having been purified by the process. This is why sacred fire was so often involved in transitions of status, of season, of life and death. Fire marked the boundaries between one state and another, and its presence assured that the crossing was clean. In the Zoroastrian tradition, this concept of purification extended to the idea that fire itself must never be polluted. To throw impure matter into a sacred fire, to contaminate it with inappropriate fuel, or to allow it to die through neglect, was to commit a serious offense against the divine order. The fire, as the visible form of truth in the world, must always be kept as pure as the truth it embodied. This attention to purity was not understood as anxiety or fear. It was more like care, the careful love of a gardener who tends a rare and beautiful plant. The meticulous attention of a craftsman who knows that the quality of their work reflects on something greater than themselves. To keep the fire pure was to say, in the clearest possible way, that truth matters, that the care we give to sacred things is a measure of what we believe about the universe. Part 5. Rome and the Eternal Flame. We travel now, still following the thread of our story, westward across the ancient world, from the Iranian plateau, through the fertile lands between the great rivers, across the sea, to the Italian peninsula and the city that would become the center of the ancient Western world, Rome. At the heart of the Roman Forum, in a small round building of elegant design, a fire burned for nearly 1,000 years. This was the flame of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, and it was tended by a group of women whose role in Roman religion was among the most sacred and socially significant in the entire civilization. These women were the Vestal virgins. To understand the Vestals, we must first understand what Vesta meant to Rome. Vesta was not a goddess of drama or adventure. She was not associated with war or transformation or the grand narratives of divine conflict. She was the goddess of the hearth, of the household fire, of the quiet burning center around which domestic life was organized. In the Roman religious imagination, every family hearth was a small echo of Vesta's sacred presence. The fire on the domestic altar was Vesta's fire brought into the home. And at the center of all of those domestic fires, at the origin point from which they all derived their sanctity, was the flame burning in the temple of Vesta in the Forum. This flame was not metaphorically eternal. It was functionally eternal. The Vestals were charged with maintaining it without interruption, and this charge was treated with the utmost seriousness. Roman religious understanding held that the sacred fire of Vesta was directly linked to the safety and continuity of Rome itself. As long as the flame burned, Rome endured. And if the flame were to go out through negligence, through accident, through some failure of attention in the night, it would be taken as an omen of grave significance, a sign that the divine protection of the city had been withdrawn. This was not a small responsibility for the women who carried it. The connection between the sacred fire and the fate of the city was not a metaphor that Romans held lightly. It was a conviction, an article of faith. The Vestals were, in this sense, not merely priestesses performing a ritual function. They were guardians of Rome's spiritual existence. Part 6. The Lives of the Vestals. The selection of a Vestal was a solemn event in Roman life, surrounded by ritual and social weight. Girls chosen for the service were between 6 and 10 years of age, selected from families of Roman citizenship and good standing, and they were required to serve for a period of 30 years. 10 years of learning, 10 years of full service, and 10 years of teaching those who came after them. During this time, they lived in the Atrium Vestae, the house of the Vestals, a substantial residence adjacent to the temple in the Forum. Their lives were ordered, purposeful, and very different from those of ordinary Roman women. They were freed from the legal authority of their fathers and husbands. They had the right to own property, to give testimony in legal proceedings, and to act independently in ways that most Roman women could not. At public events, they were given seats of honor. In the streets, they were preceded by a lictor, a ceremonial attendant who cleared the way. These privileges were not signs of personal status in the usual sense. They were expressions of the sacred role the Vestals occupied. They were understood as set apart, not above ordinary Roman life in a social hierarchy exactly, but beside it in a different category, at once more constrained and more honored than the women around them. The most famous of their obligations was the requirement of chastity. A Vestal who broke this vow was not merely subject to social censure. In the Roman tradition, she had committed an offense against the sacred order, a pollution of the divine connection between her service and Vesta's protection of the city. The punishment prescribed by Roman law and custom was, in the most extreme cases, extraordinarily harsh. She was not to be executed directly, for to shed the blood of a Vestal would itself be a sacrilege. Instead, the tradition specified that she be entombed alive in a small underground chamber near the city gates, with enough food and water to last a few days, and left. It is important to hold this information with historical care. These practices were part of a religious and social system very different from our own. We do not need to approve or condemn them. We need only to understand what they tell us about the depth of conviction Roman society attached to the sacred fire. The stakes were, by Roman understanding, that high. The fire was that important. The purity of its tenders was that closely bound to the well-being of the entire civilization. And to balance this, we should also hold in mind the more ordinary texture of Vestal life, which, for the great majority of women who served, was lived in quiet dignity. The careful rising in the night to tend the flame, the slow addition of fuel in the dark hours, watching the coals settle and the flame steady, the years of learning the prayers and the rituals. The long afternoons of the Roman Forum, where public life flowed past the temple and the Vestals moved through it, carrying their sacred function as naturally as breath. Part 7. Vesta and the Household Hearth. The Temple of Vesta was not the only fire that the Romans kept sacred. In every Roman home, the hearth held a similar, if more modest, significance. The fire of the domestic hearth was understood as the home's spiritual center, the dwelling place of the Lares and Penates, the household gods who protected the family and its continuity. When a Roman household was established, fire was brought from the sacred flame. When a new bride entered her husband's home, she was welcomed at the hearth, where offerings were made to ensure the blessing of the household gods. When a member of the household died, the fire was tended with particular care, a sign that life continued, that the household persisted. And when a family moved to a new home, they carried fire from the old hearth to kindle the new one, a literal carrying of continuity and sacred connection from one place to another. This domestic fire theology ran parallel to the public fire theology of the Vestals. The city was, in the Roman imagination, a great household. The forum was the city's hearthroom, and the flame of Vesta was the city's domestic fire, scaled up to encompass the entire community and its relationship with the divine. This is a deeply touching way to understand a civilization's spiritual life. The family and the city were connected by the same sacred symbol. The warmth of the home and the safety of the empire were understood as expressions of the same principle, and at the center of both was fire. Part 8. Comparisons and conversations between two traditions. We have now spent time in both ancient Persia and ancient Rome, and it is worth pausing here in the quiet middle of our journey to notice what these two traditions share and where they diverge. The most striking similarity is the most fundamental. Both traditions understood fire as sacred. Both treated its maintenance as a religious obligation of the highest order. Both connected the flames burning with the well-being of the community, whether that community was defined as the followers of Ahura Mazda or as the citizens of Rome. In both cases, the fire was not merely a symbol. It was a presence, a living sacred reality that required tending, that responded to care and suffered from neglect. Both traditions also connected fire with purity. In Zoroastrianism, the fire was the visible form of Asha, of truth and righteousness. In Rome, the fire of Vesta was kept pure through the ritual purity of its tenders. In both cases, impurity, whether of intent, of substance, or of conduct, was understood as damaging to the sacred flame and, through it, to the cosmic or civic order the flame represented. There are differences too, and they are interesting. The Zoroastrian sacred fire was primarily a theological symbol, a way of understanding the nature of the divine and humanity's relationship to truth. It existed within an elaborate cosmological framework involving the struggle between light and darkness, and its maintenance was understood as contributing to that struggle. The Roman sacred fire was more deeply embedded in the social and political fabric of the city. It was the city's fire, the household hearth of Rome, and its meaning was inseparable from Roman civic identity. The Zoroastrian tradition was also much more precise about the categories and qualities of sacred fire, developing over centuries an intricate system of different grades of flame and the specific rituals required for each. The Roman tradition was more unitary. There was one sacred flame in one temple tended by one group of consecrated women. And yet, when we look at these two traditions side by side, what is most striking is not the differences, but the convergence. Two great civilizations, separated by vast distances of geography and culture, came independently to the same profound conclusion: that fire is not merely a tool, that there is something in the nature of flame, something in its capacity to give light and warmth and to transform all that it touches, that speaks of the divine, that a carefully tended flame, burning steadily through the night, is a form of prayer. Part 9. Fire as Purification and Renewal. One of the most universal themes in the sacred use of fire is purification. Across virtually every ancient culture that assigned sacred significance to flame, fire was understood as an agent of cleansing, of renewal, and of transformation from one state to another. In the Zoroastrian tradition, this purification was both literal and symbolic. The careful management of the sacred fire, ensuring that only pure fuel was added, that no contaminating material came near the flame, was a daily meditation on the nature of purity itself. The fire, burning through impure material and releasing light and heat, was a daily enactment of the truth-consuming falsehood. In Rome, the annual ceremony of relighting the sacred flame of Vesta, which took place on the first day of the Roman New Year in March, was an act of communal purification and renewal. The old fire was extinguished, the one time its extinction was ritually appropriate, and a new flame was kindled by the most ancient method available to Rome, by friction, by the boring of one piece of wood into another. This new flame, born from pure effort and ancient practice, renewed the city's sacred connection for the year ahead. This pattern of extinction and relighting appears across many ancient fire traditions. It suggests a deep understanding of the renewal that fire represents. Fire is not static. It consumes itself as it burns, requiring constant feeding, constant attention. And in this, it mirrors life itself, which is also not static, which also requires constant renewal to persist. The fire that burns today is not the same fire that burned yesterday. And yet, if the flame has never gone out, it is experienced as the same flame. Continuity through constant transformation. There is a philosophical depth to this that rewards contemplation. The smoke of sacred fires also carried purifying significance. In many ancient traditions, the smoke rising from a fire was understood as carrying prayer upward, carrying the intentions and offerings of human beings into the realm of the divine. The smoke was the visible path of communication between the earthly and the heavenly. And this understanding too had practical dimensions. Many sacred fires burned aromatic woods or resins, filling the space around the flame with fragrant smoke that marked the air itself as consecrated. Part 10. Fire as Divine Mediator. Throughout all of these traditions, a consistent theme emerges. Fire is a mediator. It stands between the human and the divine, between the earthly and the heavenly, between the material world and the world of spirit. It takes the offerings of human beings, wood, grain, aromatic substances, and transforms them into smoke and light that rises toward the divine. It takes the warmth and light of the sun, the most obvious symbol of divine beneficence in the ancient world, and brings it down to the human scale, making it possible to live close to something that might otherwise only be observed from a vast distance. This mediating function is why fire was so often present at moments of transition, at the crossings between life and death, between the old year and the new, between the ordinary and the sacred. Fire marked the threshold. Its presence announced that a crossing was taking place, that the membrane between worlds was being approached. In the Zoroastrian tradition, this mediating role was made explicit in the theology of Asha. The sacred fire did not merely symbolize truth. It was the point at which divine truth touched the physical world, the place where Ahura Mazda's light was made tangible, visible, warm. To stand before the sacred fire was to stand at the point where the human and the divine most nearly met. In Rome, the mediating function of Vesta's fire was expressed through its civic dimensions. The fire mediated between the Roman people and their gods, between the present generation and the accumulated goodwill of the divine that had been built up through generations of proper observance. As long as the fire burned, the communication channel was open. The gods were still in relationship with the city, and through the city with its people. Part 11. The Psychological Flame. It would be incomplete to discuss sacred fire without acknowledging the dimension of human psychology that fire has always inhabited. This is not a departure from history. It is, in many ways, the deepest history of all. Fire calls to something in human beings that is very old and very quiet. We are drawn to it in ways that go beyond the rational. A fire burning in a hearth, even now, even in a world lit entirely by electric light, exercises a particular pull on human attention. We watch it. We find ourselves drawn into its movement, its constant shifting between forms, the way a single flame both persists and changes from moment to moment. There is a meditative quality to fire gazing that most people in most cultures recognize intuitively. The psychologist Gaston Bachelard, writing in the 20th century, described fire as the first object of reverie, the first great subject of human contemplation. He suggested that the human relationship with fire was foundational to the way human beings learn to think about change, about time, about the nature of existence itself. To watch a fire is to watch something be consumed and transformed. To watch a fire is to understand in the most visceral way that the world does not stay still. The ancient peoples who built their sacred fires understood this, at least implicitly. They were not simply performing rituals because they had been told to. They were responding to something genuine in their experience of fire, the light that drives back darkness, the warmth that makes the cold survivable, the transformation that shows that even the most solid matter is subject to change. These were experiences that demanded a spiritual response because they spoke directly to the most fundamental questions of human existence. What are we if we are not the light against the darkness? What is life if not a flame that burns for a time and then is still? What is truth if not the thing that illuminates? The sacred fires of ancient Persia and ancient Rome were not answers to these questions, they were gestures toward them. The gesture of someone who looks into the flame and, without words, acknowledges that something important is happening here, something that deserves attention, care, and reverence. Part 12. The Legacy of the Sacred Flame. The traditions we have been discussing tonight are not purely historical. They have not entirely vanished into the past like so many other elements of the ancient world. Zoroastrianism is still practiced today. The Parsi community of India, descendants of Zoroastrians who emigrated from Persia many centuries ago, maintains fire temples where sacred flames continue to burn. The Atash Bahram fires of India are tended with the same care and reverence that characterized their ancient predecessors. The prayers are still recited, the white cloth is still worn near the flame. The fire still burns as the visible presence of Asha, of truth in the world. The Roman tradition of the Vestals came to an end in the 4th century of the Common Era, when the Roman Emperor Theodosius decreed the closure of non-Christian temples and the extinguishing of the sacred fire. The temple of Vesta was closed. The eternal flame, which had burned for somewhere between 800 and 1,000 years, was extinguished. The Vestals were dismissed. This was not a small moment. For Romans who still held to the old traditions, it must have been a moment of profound grief. The fire that had burned through the Punic Wars, through the assassinations and civil conflicts and the rise and fall of the Republic, through the establishment of the empire and its centuries of changing fortunes, was gone. The city's spiritual hearth was cold. And yet, the symbolic inheritance of Vesta's fire did not entirely disappear. The imagery of the eternal flame, of the sacred fire that must not go out, passed into many subsequent traditions. The concept of an eternal light burning in a sacred space as a symbol of divine presence and continuity is familiar across many of the world's religious traditions. The symbolic thread is long, and it reaches back to those first fires in the ancient temples of Rome and Persia. Fire in the dark. We are coming now to the quieter, more contemplative part of our evening together. The historical narrative has been told, the comparisons drawn, the traditions explored. And now we can simply sit with what we have learned, the way one sits with a fire as it burns low in the evening, no longer needing to tend it, just watching. There is something that these ancient peoples understood about darkness that we, who live in a world lit so thoroughly by artificial light, have perhaps allowed to recede from our immediate experience. The darkness of the ancient night was real and profound. There were no electric lights, there were no illuminated screens. When the sun went down, the world became genuinely dark in a way that few of us now encounter regularly. And into that darkness, fire spoke. It said, "Here is warmth. Here is safety. Here, in this small circle of light, there is something to hold on to. Here, you are not entirely alone in the universe." The sacred fires were not simply utilitarian extensions of this practical experience, though they grew from it. They were its deepest expression. They said, "The light that sustains you is not an accident. It is a reflection of something in the nature of the universe itself. Truth is luminous. Goodness gives warmth. The divine is not hiding in the darkness. It is present in the light, however small, however fragile, however carefully tended." This is a message that does not age. It speaks to something in us that is as old as the first fire made by the first careful human hands. We still live in a world that has its share of darkness. We still find ourselves in the quiet hours of the night in need of something that gives light. And when we encounter it, whether it is a candle flame or a philosophy or a moment of genuine connection with another person, we recognize it. We feel its warmth. We move toward it, the way our ancestors moved toward the fire in the cave, in the clearing, in the temple. The Last Embers. We have traveled far tonight, across thousands of years and thousands of miles. We have watched the sacred fires of ancient Persia burn in their bronze vessels, tended by white-robed priests whose breath was too precious and too human to let fall on the flame. We have stood in the Roman Forum and watched the Vestals move in their careful way between the temple and the world, carrying their responsibility with a quiet steadiness that endured across the centuries. We have thought about purity and transformation, and the way that fire takes the material world and turns it into light. We have considered what it means to tend something sacred, to give daily attention to a flame that represents something greater than itself, to make the keeping of the light a form of prayer. And perhaps we have felt in the listening something of what those ancient worshippers felt when they stood before the sacred fire, not awe in the loud, dramatic sense, something quieter than that, something more like recognition, a sense that fire has always been a window into something, a place where the ordinary and the sacred are closer together than they usually appear. The fires of ancient Persia and ancient Rome are not burning tonight, at least not in the places where they once burned. The temple of Vesta has been open to the sky for more than 16 centuries. The great fire temples of the Sasanian Empire are mostly ruins now, their arches still standing in the Iranian landscape, their altars empty. But the flame that they tended is not entirely gone. It lives in the memory of the tradition. It lives in the Zoroastrian fire temples of India, where the prayers of Zarathustra are still recited before the flame. It lives in the symbolic vocabulary of our civilization, in the language we reach for when we want to describe truth, courage, devotion, or the presence of something sacred. We still speak of someone being a light in the darkness. We still speak of the flame of an idea, the spark of inspiration, the kindling of hope. And perhaps most simply and most truly, it lives in the way we still feel, even now, when we watch a fire burn, the quiet pull toward its light, the way our breathing slows, the way the mind, which so often races, grows still and begins to simply watch. The orange and gold of the flame, the movement that is never quite the same from one moment to the next, the warmth that reaches us across the distance. These ancient peoples, for all that they lived in a world very different from our own, were responding to something real, something that the fire genuinely is. And when we sit with a flame now, in whatever quiet moment of our lives allows for it, we are in some sense continuing a conversation that began in the deep darkness of prehistory. A conversation between human beings and the light that has always been with them. The fire burns low now. The embers glow with a gentle, patient warmth. The shadows at the edges of the room are soft, not threatening. The night outside is quiet. There is nothing more that needs to be said tonight. Let the warmth of this stay with you as you rest, the light that illuminates, the truth that endures, the flame tended carefully through the long and quiet years. Sleep well.